was working the closing shift at this coffee shop from around 3 p.m. until 11 p.m. It was one of those slow, boring days where hardly anyone comes in. Now, when my shift ended, I had to walk down the block to catch the bus, since I didn't have a car back then. The thing is, the buses were running really weird hours because this was on a college campus, and all the students had gone home for break. Now, I've always been the type of person who notices everything around me, like who's walking nearby, random noises, and if something's out of place. I guess I got that way because I've been through some really bad stuff in the past. So I was standing at the bus stop waiting for my ride, and the sun was starting to go down. The sky had that orangey pink color right before it gets dark. That's when this guy appeared out of nowhere. He looked like he was in his mid-20s, maybe 24 or so, and he was shorter than me, probably around 5 feet 5 inches. I noticed right away that he was pretty built, like he worked out a lot. I wasn't trying to check him out or anything. It's just something I automatically notice about people. At first, he smiled at me, and I'll be honest, it made me feel a bit better. But here's the thing that bothered me right from the start. I never saw where he came from. Like I was standing there alone, looking down the street for the bus, and when I turned around, he was just suddenly there. He immediately started making small talk, asking me questions and stuff. But what really stuck with me were his eyes. They were so dark, almost completely black. And he just kept staring directly at me the whole time, never looking away for even a second. But it didn't match the smile on his face at all. He kept talking to me, asking the usual stuff. Just normal stranger small talk. The kind people used to make all the time before COVID made everyone keep to themselves. He told me he was from Africa and that he was here studying for his master's degree. He actually seemed pretty smart and talked about his studies in detail, so I didn't think he was making it up or lying to me. Everything he said sounded legit. Finally, the bus showed up and we both got on. We ended up sitting in the front section, not right next to each other, but close enough. I stayed on for maybe 5 minutes or so. Then I pulled the cord and got off at my stop. I still had to walk about 3 more blocks to get to my place. I figured that would be the end of it. Just another weird encounter with a stranger. So I walked into work, clocked in, and started my shift like normal. A few minutes later, I happened to look up and glance outside through the window. And there he was, the same guy from the bus stop, just standing there on the sidewalk. My stomach dropped. I thought it was really strange, so I immediately told my coworkers about it. They all looked out the window and agreed it was super weird. Like, why would he be here? And here's the thing. This town was practically empty because of winter break. I'd maybe seen 10 people total around town in the past few days. Out of all those people, it had to be this creepy guy showing up outside my work. He stayed out there for about an hour, just hanging around. Then at some point, I looked up again, and he was gone. I didn't even see him leave. He just disappeared. I tried to brush it off and kept working, telling myself not to overthink it. But it definitely stuck in the back of my mind. I always carried pepper spray on me, and just knowing I had it made me feel a little safer. When my shift finally ended, I got back on the bus heading home. I got off at my stop and walked through the parking lot. Then I went into my apartment building, which was quiet as usual. My apartment was on the 2nd floor, technically the 3rd if you count it that way. I was rushing up the stairs, taking them 2 at a time with my keys already in my hand so I could get inside quickly. And when I got to the top of the staircase, I froze. That same guy was standing right there in the hallway. That's when I knew for sure something was really wrong. See, I was pretty sure I was the only person living in this building at the time since everyone had left for break. And even if other people were around, I never told this guy where I lived. Not once during our conversation did I mention my apartment building, or my apartment number, or even what street I lived on. So there was no reason for him to be there. He looked up and saw me standing there. Then he gave me another one of those friendly smiles and said my name out loud, all cheerful and casual, like we were old friends or something, but I never told him my name. I gave him a quick nod and started moving around him to get to my apartment door. He stepped back and started heading down the stairs. So I unlocked my door and started to open it. But the second I did that, he suddenly turned around and ran back up the stairs. Before I could react, he put his arm up against my door, blocking it. But he did it in this strange, friendly way. It was so confusing because part of me almost wanted to believe he had good intentions, like maybe I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew something was very, very wrong. Then he peeks inside my apartment and says he can see my Xbox in the living room from where we're standing. Before I can say anything, he just pushes past me and walks right in. He sits down on my couch and starts taking off his shoes like he's planning to stay for a while. I'm panicking inside, but trying to stay calm. I quickly tell him that my roommates are sleeping and I can't hang out because I have to work early in the morning. I also mention that my boyfriend is coming over soon. None of that was true, of course. I was lying through my teeth, hoping he'd get the hint and leave. But he just kept sitting there, not moving. He either didn't understand or didn't care that I wanted him gone. Finally, I tried a different approach. I told him maybe we could hang out some other time instead. I smiled and tried to sound casual about it. Obviously, I had zero intention of ever seeing this guy again, but I thought if I said that, he might actually leave. Then he says something that really freaked me out. He tells me he lives right across the hall from me, diagonally. Then he points toward the door like it's no big deal. But that didn't make any sense. I knew a few people who lived in those apartments across from mine. Not well, but enough to recognize them. I'd never seen this guy before, and he definitely didn't live there. That's when I got really scared. My hands were shaking, but I tried to act normal. "Hey, I'll be right back." And I walked to my bathroom. I left my front door wide open on purpose. I didn't want to be trapped in there with him if he decided to lock it or something. As soon as I got in the bathroom, I pulled out my phone and called my boyfriend. I have no idea why I didn't just call 911. I guess I was worried about overreacting or causing a big scene. Maybe I thought I was being paranoid. I don't know. My boyfriend answered and I whispered what was happening. He immediately said he was sending one of his friends to come pick me up. Thankfully, his friend was one of the few people still in town during break. I was completely freaked out in that bathroom, but I told myself to calm down and just go back out there and act friendly until he left. I took a deep breath and opened the bathroom door. But when I came out, he was putting his shoes back on. I was so confused, like, why the sudden change? But honestly, I was just relieved. I didn't question it. Then he walked out of my apartment. I watched him go down the hallway, maybe 10 feet or so, and he actually did go into the apartment diagonal from mine. He unlocked the door like he really did live there. Then I went around my entire apartment checking every single door and window to make sure they were all locked tight. I've always been really careful about security, especially living alone as a young woman, so I always double-check everything. But when I go to the back door and reach for the lock, it's unlocked. My heart just sank. I felt sick to my stomach. I immediately started crying, like full-on sobbing. I absolutely knew for a fact that I had locked that door before I left for work. Not only that, but I had also put a long wooden stick in the door track to keep it from sliding open. It's an extra security thing I always did. I had checked that door twice before leaving for my shift. I was paranoid about it. The stick was completely gone, and I never found it again, not even later when I searched my whole apartment. My boyfriend convinced me to call the police and report what happened. It was pretty obvious this guy's intentions weren't good. The cops came out that night and went to knock on the apartment he'd gone into. Nobody answered the door, so they couldn't do much right then. They left a patrol car parked nearby to keep an eye on things, which made me feel a little better. The next day, the police contacted the building owners and got permission to actually enter that apartment. And guess what? He didn't live there at all. Turns out he'd been squatting in that empty apartment ever since the 4 students who actually lived there left for Thanksgiving break. He'd just been staying there illegally the whole time, probably watching me come and go. After that, the police didn't really do much else. I mean, I guess it makes sense in a way. He was gone by then, and they couldn't find him. But it still felt frustrating that nothing more came of it. He just got away with it. Nobody else had any information about this guy either. The police couldn't find out where he actually lived. It was like he was a ghost. I understand all the red flags I missed, and all the things I should have done differently. I should have called the police right away instead of my boyfriend. I should have never let him in my apartment. I should have trusted my gut from the very beginning when something felt off at that bus stop. But in the moment, you don't always make the right choices. You second guess yourself. You don't want to seem rude or paranoid. This story still gives me that sick, uneasy feeling in my stomach whenever I think about it. Just like some of the scary stories I read online. I got lucky that night. I don't even want to think about what could have happened. So please, everyone, be safe out there. Trust your instincts. Five years ago, I spent Thanksgiving at my cousin's house in South Carolina. Their home sits on top of a large hill, and the property has always been unique because of its elevation and the dense woods that surround it. That afternoon around 2 o'clock, my cousin and I decided to take a walk down the hillside into the woods behind their house. We didn't venture too far from the house. In fact, we could still see it clearly through the trees from where we were standing. The timing is important, because 2 p.m. is when our family typically gathers together for Thanksgiving dinner. Everyone was at the house preparing food and setting up tables. We had just stepped away for a few minutes to explore the woods and enjoy the peaceful afternoon. We were walking down the hill through the woods when we stopped for a moment to look at something. I honestly can't remember what caught our attention, but we had paused there. The forest around us was completely silent, not a single bird chirping or leaves rustling. Then out of nowhere, I heard this incredibly loud gust of wind rushing through the trees. And at the same time, there were these massive thundering footsteps. The sound was so powerful it startled me. I immediately spun around to see what was making that noise. That's when I caught a glimpse of something about 80 feet away from us. It was only visible for a split second, but I saw this creature on all 4 legs. The thing that stood out most was its fur. It was this pale, creamy color, somewhere between white and beige, like butter. Whatever it was big and moving fast through those woods. Then this creature suddenly sprinted alongside us, running parallel to where we were standing. It ran between some trees, weaving through them with surprising speed, and then just like that, everything went dead silent again. It was like someone had hit a mute button on the entire forest. The thing I remember most clearly was its fur. It was long and shaggy, similar to what you'd see on a long-haired dog. It's actually really hard to describe accurately, but if you look up pictures of a sheepdog online, that's probably the best comparison I can give you. The fur had that same thick, flowing quality to it. At that moment, the fear took over completely. My cousin and I didn't say a word to each other. We just turned around and ran as fast as we could back up the hill toward the house. My heart was racing the entire way. When we finally made it back and caught our breath, I immediately asked him if he had seen it too. He confirmed that yes, he saw the exact same thing I did. But here's the strange part. He didn't react much at all. He wasn't scared or even particularly concerned. He just acted like it was nothing unusual, like it didn't bother him in the slightest. Part of me thinks he believes I'm making the whole thing up, and he's just going along with my story. His family has a habit of making up stories or making things sound bigger than they really are. About an hour later, we went back to that same spot in the woods. This part is a little unclear in my mind, because I'm not sure what I actually remember and what my brain made up over time. Sometimes our brains create false memories and mix them with real ones. But I think when we got back to the place where we had been standing earlier, there was what looked like a footprint on the ground. It was in a bare patch of dirt where the leaves had been pushed away or moved aside. I wish I could remember the print more clearly, but the details are really hazy in my mind. What I do recall is thinking at the time that it looked somewhat similar to a bear's claw print, but there was something different about it that didn't quite match up. I believe it had 6 toes instead of the usual 5 that bears have, and one of them had this thumb-like appearance to it, which was strange. I also remember thinking the print was quite round in shape, more like a paw than anything else. But honestly, you should take all of this with a grain of salt, because my memory of the print itself is extremely fuzzy and unreliable. I'm not confident about those details at all. So the big question is, what could this creature possibly have been? My initial thought was that maybe it was a polar bear with some kind of physical disability or birth defect that caused it to look different. But that doesn't make any sense because polar bears don't live in South Carolina. They're Arctic animals. Then I considered the possibility of it being an albino black bear, which would explain the light coloring. However, my cousin's family regularly watches for bears on their property since they live in bear country. If there was an albino bear living in those woods, they definitely would have spotted it again by now. Plus, the color wasn't the pure, stark white you'd expect from an albino animal. It was more of a dirty, creamy beige color mixed with white, like it had been rolling around in dirt or something. I've thought about this for years now, and I'm completely at a loss for what it could have been. I moved in with my uncle, and it's been great so far. His house is pretty spacious, and I'm lucky enough to have the entire finished basement to myself. Down here, I've got a really large living area where I can relax and do my own thing, plus my own bedroom, a kitchen for when I want to cook, a full bathroom, and even a storage room for all my extra stuff. My uncle, my grandfather, and I all live in this house together now. My uncle finished building it back in 1999, so it's over 20 years old, but still in good shape. Before we moved in, he was pretty much the only one who ever lived here, aside from some of his past girlfriends and romantic partners over the years. On Monday night, I was up a little later than usual, probably around 4 a.m. or so. Since my only job right now is being a musician, I don't really have a set schedule, and I don't need to get up early in the mornings like most people do. I was just hanging out in the basement doing my thing when I started to hear talking coming from somewhere in the house. My first thought was, oh great, I must have forgotten to turn the TV off upstairs. I better go turn that off before it bothers anyone. But then I realized something. I knew for sure it wasn't my uncle and grandfather talking to each other, because I can always hear their footsteps when they walk around upstairs. But I hadn't heard any footsteps at all, just voices. That's when I started to feel a little uneasy about the whole situation. Plus, my grandfather uses a walker to get around, which makes even more noise than regular footsteps. You can definitely hear that thing moving across the floor. So I opened my bedroom door and checked. The TV in the living area was completely off. The second I saw that, I got instant chills running down my spine. So I went back downstairs and laid back down in bed, trying to convince myself it was nothing, but the voices didn't stop at all. It sounded like a muted conversation between two men, just talking back and forth to each other. The thing is, sound travels really well in this house. When someone else is talking anywhere upstairs, I can usually hear them pretty clearly. I can literally hear both my uncle and my grandfather talking on the phone in their rooms above mine. But this was different. It was more muffled and harder to make out, like the sound was coming from somewhere else entirely. After what felt like forever, the voices finally stopped and everything went quiet again. I thought I could finally relax and get some sleep, so I turned off all my lights and laid back down in bed. I was just starting to calm down when suddenly I heard a woman groan from somewhere upstairs. I was pretty terrified at that point. A woman's voice? There's no woman living in this house. Just me, my uncle, and my grandfather. Fast forward to Thanksgiving dinner a few days later. We were all sitting around the table eating, and I started telling this whole story to my uncle. I barely got through the first part when he suddenly stopped me. He had this look on his face like he knew exactly what I was talking about. He told me that he constantly hears conversations that he can't quite make out. It's been happening to him for a while now. He said it always sounds like there's a TV on in another room somewhere in the house. But here's the creepy part. No matter what room you go into to check, you can never find where the sound is actually coming from. It just keeps seeming like it's coming from somewhere else. My grandfather nodded along too, saying he's heard strange things over the years but never wanted to bring it up. Now I know I'm not crazy, but honestly, that almost makes it worse. At least if I was just hearing things, I could explain it away.
Back when I was 20, during the summer before my senior year of college, I landed an internship at a financial services firm downtown. It wasn't anything fancy, mostly data entry, spreadsheets, and sitting in front of a computer all day, but it paid decently and it looked great on a resume. There were 7 other interns behind me, and we were all crammed together in this open office section with rows of cubicles that didn't quite give you privacy, just enough to make small talk feel optional. Out of the 7, 5 of them were people I liked, a mix of chill, down-to-earth college students who didn't take the internship too seriously. Another guy, Eric, was the type who treated the whole thing like it was life or death, barely spoke, and was always typing like his keyboard owed him money. But the 7th intern, Alex, was something else entirely. When I first met Alex, he seemed normal enough, maybe a little awkward, but we all were at the beginning. He was tall, thin, kind of pale, and had this mop of dark hair that always looked a little unwashed. He didn't really fit the finance intern stereotype, but that's not what threw me off. It was the way he acted around me. At first, it was subtle. He'd pop up at my cubicle during the day, lean over the divider in a way that made him look freakishly tall, like 7 feet tall because the cubicle walls were low, and only his head would be visible above it. He'd tilt his head slightly, grin with a strange frozen smile, and start talking in this deliberately weird voice, like he was trying to sound creepy on purpose. I'd laugh it off awkwardly, pretending I thought it was funny, but I remember thinking it was an odd thing to do in a professional setting. He'd say random stuff, like "working hard" or "hardly working, Ronnie," in that slow, unnatural tone, and then hold the smile for way too long. The first couple of times, I figured he was just being quirky or trying too hard to stand out. Some people at internships are awkward like that, so I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. But then it started happening more often. Every single day, at least once, I'd see his head slowly rise above my cubicle wall. That same stretched grin plastered across his annoying face, and he'd start some bizarre conversation that didn't make sense. Sometimes he'd make jokes that weren't funny, or mutter random phrases that didn't relate to anything. And every time, he used that same unsettling voice, like a soft voice in a kind of taunting way. Honestly, a very good recent comparison of the voice he was doing was the voice Charlie Hunnam did for his role as Ed Gein. The other interns noticed it too, but they mostly laughed it off, thinking Alex was being weird on purpose to lighten the mood. I also think they thought Alex and I had built some kind of rapport that the rest of them didn't build with him. There was something about the way he directed it only at me that made me feel uncomfortable. It's not like I treated him any differently. It was like I was his personal audience for whatever creepy act he was trying to pull. As the weeks went on, his visits got longer. He'd lean over and stay there for minutes at a time, staring at me while talking. Sometimes not even saying much, just looking. I'd fake a laugh, say I had to finish a report, and hope he'd get the hint. He rarely did. Then one night, about 6 weeks into the internship, I was home eating dinner when my phone rang.
So tasty, it could make Poseidon switch to a spoon. Wholly divine taste from the Greek gods.
Adobe Acrobat Studio is all new. What can PDF Spaces with AI do? Do a sales invoice good enough to eat?
It was a number I didn't recognize. I normally don't answer unknown calls, but since I was expecting a delivery confirmation, I picked it up. When I said hello, all I heard for a few seconds was silence. Then, suddenly, I heard a voice I recognized immediately. It was Alex's voice. The same forced, creepy tone he always used in the office. He said, "The tide's coming in. Pull your boat out of the water." But this time, his voice was a little louder, almost a yell. He dragged the words out like he was reciting a riddle, and then he burst out laughing this insanely unhinged laugh before hanging up. The thing that made my skin crawl wasn't just the call. It was the fact that I never gave Alex my number, not once. The next thing I did was text the number back, asking if this was Alex. But the text said not delivered, and when I looked it up, it was a landline number. That's when I really started to get freaked out. How did he get my number? Why was he calling me like that? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he found it through a company contact sheet or something. But even then, the way he said that line didn't sit with me. I couldn't stop replaying the sound of his laugh in my head. It didn't sound like someone joking around. It sounded like he was f***ing with me to the point of trying to actually scare me. This wasn't just goofy behavior anymore. That Monday, when I got to the office, Alex wasn't there. His desk was empty, and I didn't see him all morning. I went to our supervisor, a guy named Martin, and I asked him if Alex might have gotten my number through the company. And Martin was very confused, saying interns didn't have access to employee info like that. On top of that, they'd let Alex go at the end of the previous week because he wasn't doing any work and had ignored multiple warnings. That's when I told him about the call. He seemed surprised, and some of the other interns overheard. A couple of them started nodding and saying they always thought Alex was creepy, that he'd made them uncomfortable too. I told them about the weird cubicle visits, the voice, everything. Martin said not to worry, that Alex was gone for good and had no reason to come back. So that was a little comforting. For the next week or so, I kept expecting something else to happen. A message, a random encounter, something, but nothing came. Life at the office went back to normal. I figured maybe that was really the end of it. Until one early morning. It was a Friday, around 5 a.m. Still dark outside, except for a thin gray light creeping in through the blinds. I woke up because I thought I'd heard something, maybe a noise from outside. It made me get up and look out my window. I wish I hadn't. Standing in my backyard, halfway between the trees and the porch light, was a figure looking up at my window. Even though it was barely light out, I could tell who it was immediately. The thin frame and the messy hair, the way he stood perfectly straight. It was Alex. For a few seconds, I could not move. I just stared at him, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. And then, clear as day, I heard him call out my name in that same creepy, performative voice he'd always used at work. He dragged it out, long and sing-songy. I grabbed my phone, about to call 911, when I saw him tilt his head back and start laughing. That same loud, hysterical laughter like he did on the phone before hanging up. It didn't sound right. It sounded like someone completely detached from reality. I shouted through the window, yelling at him that I was calling the police and to get the hell off my property. I also waved my phone out the window. He just stood there for a second longer, then turned and started walking away, still laughing as he disappeared into the trees behind my house. I called the police, and in short, the dispatcher asked me if he was still there. When I said no, she told me to call back if he came back or threatened to break in. I never saw him again after that. Not at work, not around town, nowhere. The police couldn't do much since he hadn't technically broken in or made a direct threat. It was one of those situations where you just have to live with the unease, hoping it's over. The rest of the summer passed without incident. I finished the internship, and on the last day, my boss pulled me aside to offer me a permanent position for after graduation. At the time, I accepted, though a small part of me felt unsettled about ever going back to that office again. I never told them about what had happened that morning. I didn't see the point. Alex was gone, and no one even knew where he'd ended up. Over time, I convinced myself that he must have been dealing with some kind of mental illness or social disorder, something that made him act that way. It's the only way I can make sense of how he went from a quiet, awkward intern to standing in my backyard at 5 in the morning, laughing like a lunatic. It's been a few years now, and I've moved on from it. I didn't end up with that company. I got a different job after graduation. I don't think about this too often anymore, but sometimes the thought of that image of him in my backyard still skeeves me out. I still wonder how he got my number, how he found my address, and what he wanted that morning. I guess it's not that hard to get people's info online these days. All I know is that for a few months in my life, I worked alongside someone who wasn't just strange, he had something way deeper going on. And no matter how many years pass, I'll never forget the sound of him laughing in the dark, as if it was all one big joke that only he understood.
Get the right care right away. Because life. Highmark Blue Shield.
Save up to $1,000 on special deals during Ray Moore and Flanagan's early Black Friday sale.
I was 17 when this all happened. It was my first real job, working at a local grocery store in our quiet Vermont town. The kind of town where everyone knew everyone else, and where nothing ever really happened. I liked the job at first. It was simple, and most of my coworkers were friendly. I quickly fell into a rhythm with the cashiers and some of the stock workers, especially during the slow hours when there weren't many customers. When that happened, we'd all gather near the front of the store, just chatting about random stuff like what we watched on TV, making fun of the older, quirkier employees, and complaining about customers. That sort of thing. It was one of the few times during my shifts where I felt like I wasn't just standing behind a register staring at a screen or a blank wall all day. Depending on who was the shift supervisor for the day, it would either be relaxed or more strict. Like if a younger supervisor was working, it would be more chill. People would be on their phones and people would socialize by the front. There was one coworker who I didn't know well at first, a guy named Sean. He was 24, a little awkward, the kind of guy who always seemed like he didn't quite know how to read social cues. He had longer hair, but kind of in the awkward in-between phase, like he was growing it out but didn't quite reach his shoulders yet. He worked in the dairy section, so we didn't interact much at work. He was quiet and polite enough, and I honestly didn't think much of him. Most people just nodded at him when they walked past, and he did the same. But eventually, I was added to a coworker group chat, and he was in it. I didn't think twice about it. It was just a chat for work stuff and dumb jokes, and it seems most of the younger employees were in there. But then Sean started messaging me directly. At first, it was harmless. He asked about my shifts, whether I was covering certain days, things like that. But over the next few weeks, it became clear he was trying to get closer. He started asking questions about my personal life, like what music I liked, what I do after work, even little things like what I did over the weekend. Again, I didn't think much of it at first. I mean, people make small talk, right? But the tone was off. Sometimes he'd call me cute in ways that made me uncomfortable. Sometimes he'd make jokes that were slightly flirty. I tried to ignore it, thinking maybe he just didn't know how to behave with girls my age. That's another thing. I was only 17, he was decently older than me, and I don't think anyone else knew he was flirting with me like that. It didn't take long before the behavior became slightly annoying. He'd comment on things I posted online, and sometimes the messages were late at night. Not threatening, not really, but there was this persistence in him that made me uneasy. I didn't know how to tell him to back off without making it awkward at work, so I mostly ignored him. Don't shit where you eat, I always hear people say. One day, I was at home watching Stranger Things, my favorite show still to this day. I'd been catching up on the latest season, binge watching episodes in my bedroom, just completely lost in the show. And then a couple days later at work, everyone was gathered at the front of the store chatting about TV shows. I was talking with a few of the cashiers about some random series, when Sean suddenly asked me, "You like Stranger Things, right?" I froze. I couldn't remember telling anyone at work about my show. I just nodded, trying to brush it off, but it left this cold feeling in my stomach. How did he know? I didn't say anything. I did make eye contact for a moment. He just smiled awkwardly and eventually left the front of the store back to the dairy section like nothing had happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me more than I had realized. It wasn't until a few nights later that the fear really started. I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep after a long day at work. The house was quiet, and then I heard a soft scraping noise against my bedroom window. At first, I thought it was the wind or maybe a branch brushing against the glass, but then I heard it again. A distinct sound of someone tapping on the window, just lightly enough for it to be unnerving. I got up and peeked through the blinds, half expecting to see Sean out there, but there was nothing. I tried to convince myself the sound was nothing to be alarmed about, but the thought of Sean's question at work, about Stranger Things, a show I hadn't told anyone about, it kept running through my head. A couple of days later, he texted me again. This time I didn't ignore it. I told him clearly and firmly that I wasn't interested. That was when things escalated. Almost immediately, he replied, "Okay, good luck changing your address." I couldn't believe it. In one insane text that he clearly sent before thinking of the repercussions, he proved my suspicions right. I saved the messages and took screenshots. I went straight to my manager and explained everything. My manager was shocked. He told me not to worry, that they'd handle it. I also went with my dad to the local police department to file a report, showing them the messages and explaining the incident with the window, explaining that I suspected Sean might be stalking me. The next day at work, Sean was called in by our boss. He didn't come back. It turned out he was fired on the spot, and the police started the paperwork for a restraining order. I thought maybe that would be the end of it, but I quickly realized that nothing really felt over. Even with the restraining order in place, If he was actually a crazy person, what's a piece of paper gonna do to stop him from coming back to the house and doing something crazy?
Nationwide is so much more than a great insurance company. They're one of America's largest financial services companies. Like how I'm more than just Peyton Manning. I'm also motivating Manning. When I say insurance, you say financial services. Insurance.
I double-checked locks obsessively, refused to answer any calls or messages from unknown numbers, and avoided talking about my routines with anyone except family. The weeks dragged on like that. I would wake up at night convinced I heard something outside. I had to remind myself constantly that the restraining order was legally binding, that he couldn't come near me, but the fear was real. Eventually, as the weeks turned into months, the paranoia started to fade. There were no incidents, no attempts to contact me, no sudden appearances. The restraining order seemed to hold, and life slowly returned to normal. I got more comfortable going out alone, stopped checking my window obsessively before bed, and eventually, I stopped thinking about Sean altogether. It took a long time, though, for me to feel fully safe again. Even after moving on, the experience left a mark. I was hyper-aware of my surroundings, cautious about new people I met, especially in situations where I felt isolated. I learned to trust my instincts and take any uncomfortable behavior seriously, no matter how small it seemed at first. Looking back, the thing that scares me most isn't that Sean might have actually harmed me, it's how quickly someone who seems normal, even awkward or harmless, can turn into a source of fear. It can start with small, seemingly innocent interactions, messages, questions, little comments, and escalate into something far more serious. Now, years later, I've moved past it. I work in a different town, live in a new apartment, and I don't think about that grocery store anymore. I don't talk to a single coworker from that job anymore. But the memory of those nights lying in bed, convinced someone was outside my window, it's not something that ever goes away entirely. It's a reminder of how quickly life can feel unsafe, even in a small, quiet town where nothing ever seems to happen. And while Sean never came close to doing anything physically, the psychological impact was enough to make me question how safe I ever truly was. So if you're ever at work and notice a coworker crossing a line, even subtly, take it seriously. Don't brush it off as awkwardness or harmless flirting. It might seem over the top at first, but it could save you from months of fear, or worse. Because sometimes, the danger isn't obvious. But eventually, I did move on. And now, years later, I can look back and say I survived. And that's enough. When I was 26, I started working at a small insurance office in a quiet part of Pennsylvania. The kind of office that's tucked behind a strip mall with one long row of desks, flickering fluorescent lights, and the smell of coffee at all hours of the day. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and I liked most of the people there. The job could get boring, especially on slow days when the phones barely rang, but it was easy money. I usually worked the day shift, but on this particular Friday, I was scheduled to help close up the office because we were behind on filing a batch of client records. There was a big storm warning that afternoon, the kind that takes over the entire local news broadcast. The moment I woke up and looked out the window that morning, I knew it was going to be a dark, stormy day. And around 3 o'clock, the rain started to pour so heavily you couldn't see the end of the street. The thunder came soon after, shaking the windows every few minutes. Honestly, I was personally enjoying the ambiance of the storm. Then the manager decided to let most of the employees leave early before it got worse, but a couple of us volunteered to stay to finish some paperwork. The only other person who stayed was a guy named Tom, who had just started working there about 2 weeks prior. He was in his early 30s, tall, quiet, and sort of off-putting in a way I couldn't describe. I wouldn't say creepy, just strange. He never said much to anyone, but he was always nearby. If I went to make coffee, he'd be there 2 minutes later. If I was restocking paper, he'd show up pretending to do the same thing. I figured he was just socially awkward. When 5 o'clock hit, the storm was in full force. I swear, every few seconds lightning flashed, followed by thunder that made the floor vibrate. The office felt emptier than usual, and the usual hum of lights was replaced by the sound of the storm. Tom was sitting at his desk a few rows down, typing something on his computer that looked like nonsense from where I sat. Every time I looked up, I could see him glancing over in my direction. At first, I tried to focus on my work, but after an hour or so, I realized I hadn't seen him get up once. Around 6:30, the power started flickering. Both of us made the same nervous laugh when the lights dimmed, but he didn't say anything. The next flicker lasted longer, and when the power finally went out completely, the office went silent except for the rain. The emergency lights kicked in, leaving everything bathed in a faint orange glow. I said something about maybe it being a good time to head out, but Tom didn't respond. I heard the sound of keys jingling, and then the front door locking. He muttered something about how it wasn't safe to go outside right now. I thought maybe he was just trying to be helpful, but something about the way he said it gave me chills. I went to grab my bag and jacket, figuring I'd wait it out for a few minutes before heading home. The power outage made the whole building feel smaller. The emergency lights barely lit the hallways, and the storm outside was deafening. When I came back toward the front, Tom was standing near the door, just staring out into the dark parking lot. The rain was falling so heavily you couldn't see anything past the glass. I told him I was going to make a quick call to my boyfriend to let him know I'd be home soon. He didn't say anything again. He stood there staring out the window.
Hit pause on whatever you're listening to and hit play on your next adventure. This fall, get double points on every qualified stay. Life's a trip. Make the most of it at Best Western. Visit bestwestern.com for complete terms and conditions.
I walked toward the break room, but when I tried using my phone, there was no signal. I figured the storm must have knocked out the tower. I tried the landline, but the line was dead too. I turned around to go back to the main office, and nearly jumped when I saw Tom standing in the doorway. I hadn't even heard him walk up. He was holding a small flashlight under his chin, casting shadows up his face. He had this half smile, like he thought it was funny. I forced a nervous laugh and told him he scared me. I then asked him again about unlocking the door so I could leave, but he said something about it not being safe yet, and how it was better to wait until the worst of the storm passed. I said fine, but inside I was starting to feel nervous. He kept watching me. I decided to move to my cubicle to pack up my stuff, pretending to be calm. I wanted to wait for a lull in the storm and then get out. When I looked up again a few minutes later, Tom was gone. I figured maybe he went to the restroom. I took the chance to head to the back door instead of the front one. I knew that one led to a small parking lot behind the building where my car was. When I reached it, I realized the handle wouldn't move. The door was chained shut from the inside, like someone had looped a chain and padlock around it. We had never done that before. I turned around and saw the faint glow of the flashlight coming from down the hallway. I ducked into the supply closet next to the break room and closed the door quietly, trying to keep my breathing under control. I could hear Tom walking slowly through the hall, and then I heard him call my name. He sounded like he was trying to sound comforting. He said he just wanted to make sure I was safe. I didn't move or say a word. My heart was pounding so hard I thought he could probably hear it. He walked past the closet, and for a few seconds, I could see the thin strip of light from the flashlight shining under the door. Then it disappeared. A loud crack of thunder made the building shake. The sound of rain got even louder for a second, and I realized part of the roof above the break room must have been leaking. I waited, I'd estimate 10 minutes before I finally worked up the nerve to open the door a little. The hall was empty. The flashlight beam was gone. I stepped out carefully and made my way toward the front again. When I turned the corner, I froze. The front glass door had been shattered completely. Rain was blowing inside across the floor, soaking the carpet. Tom was nowhere in sight. I hesitated, wondering if he had gone outside, but then I realized this was my only chance. I ran out the door into the pouring rain and sprinted for my car. I didn't even care that I was getting drenched. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. I sped out of the parking lot without looking back once. When I finally got home, I locked every door and sat in my living room shaking, watching the rain pour against my windows. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I called the office and told my manager what had happened. He didn't believe me at first, until he got there himself and saw the broken glass. He called the police, who showed up and took a statement from me when I was at the office. They said they'd look into it, but it sounded like Tom had just taken off. His car was still in the lot, unlocked, with the keys sitting on the driver's seat. His phone, wallet, and a few personal items were still inside. The security cameras had been turned off manually before the power outage, which meant he must have done it earlier in the night. Nobody ever saw him again. A few of my coworkers said maybe he had some kind of breakdown, but I couldn't stop wondering if he'd been planning something worse. I quit the job a month later. Even though nothing ever happened after that, I couldn't work in a small, enclosed place like that where I had experienced such a traumatic incident. It just wasn't healthy.
You hungry?
Starving.
Some call it picky.
No tomatoes. I got you.
We call it perfect. Because sometimes making your day is the best.
It was my first year of university. I had just finished unpacking all of my stuff into my room, and my family had just left. Later on that same day, my roommate finally arrived, and right from the get-go, I knew this kid was the most socially inept person I'd ever met. I introduced myself as Dan, sticking out my arm for a handshake. He paused, looked down at my arm as if he didn't understand at first, then laughed and went, "Oh," and gave me an almost dead fish handshake. I had to ask him for his name since he didn't even tell me when we shook hands. He was Dale. I tried to make small talk, but he just answered my questions with yes or no's, occasionally awkwardly laughing or smiling. Within minutes, we were both just sitting on our beds, on our laptops, not talking to each other. I was upset and planned on requesting to be placed with a different roommate. Anyone would be better than Dale. I thought Dale was just a really awkward kid, but I soon learned he was much more than just that. I met some of the other kids on my floor and they seemed cool, so that was good. I came back to my dorm after looking around campus the first night to find Dale still in the same position he was in when I left. I said, "What's up, Dale?" and he didn't answer. Not to my surprise. It was 9:30, I didn't have anything to do, so I turned out the lamp on my side of the room and went to bed. I didn't actually fall asleep anytime soon though. Dale was on his laptop until 3 in the morning. When he finally closed his laptop, I fell asleep pretty quickly, but I woke up within the hour. The blinds to our room had been opened, and the moonlight now creeping into the room made everything visible, including Dale sitting on the side of his bed, looking at me. I sat up, rubbed my eyes, and said, "Dale, what the hell are you doing?" He whispered back, "Sorry," and laid down. The next morning, I woke up to find Dale had already gotten up. I felt like it was the first time he left the room. It was a Saturday, the first Saturday of the year, meaning orientation and all the campus festivities. During the orientation, as my group was walking by the school gardens, I heard a couple of students ahead of me saying, "What is that kid doing in there?" I saw who they were talking about. It was Dale, literally sitting in the dirt behind a patch of bushes, rubbing the bark of a tree with his hand. The orientation leader didn't notice, otherwise I'm sure she would have said something. I just walked by not saying anything, eventually telling the two kids I overheard that he was my roommate as a way to start a conversation and maybe make some friends. They apologized for me. None of us really knew if it was appropriate to laugh or not, but we did. I made friends with those two kids, and we made plans to get together that night. I also learned when I got back to my dorm that the school found another roommate for me. Things seemed to be turning around quickly for the better. I left the room that night to go meet up with the two kids I met, and when I got back, Dale was sitting on the desk chair facing the door. I said, "Oh, hey, what's up?" He said nothing, very matter-of-factly. I sat down on my bed and opened my laptop, and realized I forgot to lock it. I also realized that all of my emails had been opened. Emails I was pretty sure I didn't even read, and a bunch of folders of mine had been opened. Dale must have snooped through my laptop. When I asked him if he did, he responded no very loudly, half a second after I even finished my question. I could read him like a book. This creepy kid was literally going through my computer when I was out. I knew he did it, but I didn't pursue it. I was ready to go to bed, so as I went into my bed to look for my pajamas, I felt like my clothing had all been moved around as well. I knew I'd be out of there forever by tomorrow, so I didn't say anything. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of a zipper. I sat up and saw Dale on the ground, going through my bag. I turned the lamp on, this time confronting him about it. He played dumb, saying, "I think you have my toothbrush by mistake." It was the closest thing to wits that he'd shown up until that point. Still, I knew he was lying, and I knew something was wrong with him, so I couldn't get physical with him. The next day, I met my new roommate in the same building, and everything went well. Sunday night, after having a decent conversation with my roommate, who was no social butterfly, but was miles better than Dale, we both turned off our lights and went to bed. For the third night in a row, I woke up at some off hour of the night to a strange noise. It was a weird clicking noise. It wasn't consistent, but I'd hear it at least twice every 30 seconds. I got up, hoping to find something innocent, like a heavy bag putting pressure on a weak floorboard, or even a mouse. But as I scoped out the room, I realized the sound was actually coming from the other side of the door. The nightlight in the common area was always on, so when I looked through the peephole, I was able to see the scalp of the person standing on the other side of our door. They were looking down, so I couldn't see their face, but now that I was paying attention, I realized the tiny clicking noises were actually coming from the doorknob. I was sure the person was trying to unlock the door. I dialed the number for the campus police department, and they showed up in under 5 minutes to the common room, and only then did I feel it was safe to open the door. I found the officers to have Dale in cuffs. I had a feeling it was him. I told them everything, that he was my former roommate who was going through my stuff, so I switched dorms, only to find him trying to break into my new dorm. They took him away. I don't know what happened to him after that, but I never saw him again. He either got suspended for the semester or expelled. I got through the rest of my years at university like anybody else. However, the nightmarish experience I had with Dale still pops up in my head every now and then. I went to Binghamton University for 2 years. I quickly made a big group of friends there, and we'd go out every weekend. One weekend on a Friday night in October, when my group didn't have any big plans together, me and 2 other close friends decided to hang out in the school nature preserve by the lake. There was this little clearing on the far side of the lake that was convenient for fires. Since it was so far from view of the school or campus security, kids would sometimes, but not often, come here to smoke pot, drink, and do basically all the other drugs. It was a relatively unknown spot on campus by most, and we liked that about it. Tonight we just brought a bunch of beers, lit a fire, and hung out, having what we referred to at the time as a bro chat. As the night progressed, time seemed to pass quicker as the alcohol began to take effect. Eventually it got to the point where we were all laughing so hard that one of my 2 friends was on the floor rolling in the leaves. That was when my other friend stopped laughing and went, "Shh." We all perked up and listened, and heard the crunching of leaves and branches in the distance. We threw our bottles in the lake since we were all under 21, and it wasn't unheard of for campus police to come through the woods on weekends to catch kids doing drugs. We tucked the rest of the beers into a backpack. I was moderately drunk, so my paranoia was higher than usual. That was probably the case for all of us. The fire exposed us to anyone passing through the woods. But the thing is, this spot was so unknown and far from campus that it was rare to find anybody else that deep into the woods. It sounded like just one person in the distance. The sound of a tree branch snapping not too far away freaked all of us out. None of us were really the confrontational ones from our group, so we were lacking that one person who would have the confidence to stand up and yell out to whoever was out there. Instead, we all just sat in silence, shushing each other. We heard what seemed to be somebody or something circling us, or at least walking around in a C shape around our little campsite. It literally started to feel like we were in the movie The Blair Witch Project, because these sounds in the near distance, like cracking tree branches and leaves crunching on the ground, kept echoing over to our campsite. We laughed about it at first, but I personally soon became terrified of who or what it could be. Out of the blue, a huge thud made all three of us jump. At first I didn't understand, even though I saw what caused the sound. It took me a few seconds to digest the fact that a branch had been thrown into the center of our little fire site. One of my two friends took off running, while my other friend and I sat behind, looking at each other, half laughing, half concerned. I feel like we didn't know yet if this was some kind of joke or not. Then, my friend let out a scream of pain as he was struck in the face by another tree branch. I grabbed the backpack, helped my friend up off the floor, and we hauled ass back in the direction of our dorm. When we made it to the road separating the nature preserve from our dorm, we stopped to catch our breath. But whoever was out there proved to be following us when we heard footsteps coming closer to the road. We continued to run back to the dorm, and when we got back to our floor, we found our other friend in his room already. We looked out of his room window down to the woods. There was someone pacing back and forth by the woods, and every time a car passed, they would walk back into the woods. Eventually, whoever it was went back into the woods for good, to never be seen again by us. We continued our drinking session in the dorm room, and within 10 minutes we were all laughing about it. It wasn't until the next morning that we all realized how terrifying that experience actually was. We never really went back into the woods past dark after that. This takes place during the first week of school, my freshman year at the University of Iowa. I was just starting to get comfortable with my roommate. He was dedicated to the idea of rushing a fraternity, and rush week was starting the next week, but the parties were starting Thursday of the first week. My roommate didn't want to go alone because it would be harder to meet people that way, so he wanted me to go. I happily agreed to go with him. Even though I had no interest in rushing a fraternity, I still had intentions to go to parties. After all, I was attending a party school. My roommate wanted to go to one frat party on Thursday, and then parties at different frat houses on Friday and Saturday. On this Thursday night, we were headed to perhaps one of the lowest ranked frats. I'm pretty sure it was an underground one too. But his logic in attending was to have a backup frat in case the higher ones wouldn't give him a bid. The frat house was really far from campus in a much more slummy downtown area. We pulled up to a corner house, and if it weren't for the blasting music and cars parked everywhere, we would never picture this house as a frat house. It literally looked like they settled with the first house they found. We knocked on the door to immediately be greeted by some short, chubby guy in a white t-shirt holding a Solo cup. His shirt had sweat stains by his armpits and mid-belly area. He told us to come right in. The party itself was in a horribly dimly lit room with probably 50 guys bunched up into the living room. It was hot as hell in there to make it even worse. I think I saw maybe 2 girls at the entire party, neither of them even close to attractive. I gave the party a good 20 minutes, talking with one overweight foreigner after another, all giving off antisocial vibes. Eventually I waved for my roommate to get ready to leave, but a huge group of guys by the door made us decide to wait a little longer to avoid the awkwardness of leaving early. I continued to drink the cheap beers they were serving. I think I downed 5 cups before I could even feel a buzz. A heavy guy approached me with a tiny bottle in his hand and handed it to me, smirking and saying, "That'll get you shit-faced." I fake laughed and thanked him, expecting him to go away, but he just watched me as if he were waiting for me to drink it. So, I did. It was maybe 2 shots worth of some kind of hard liquor. The guy then started making conversation with me, and every time I hinted that I was trying to get away, he would try to pull me further into this otherwise one-sided conversation. Things started to get really blurry pretty soon. I remember feeling dizzy all of a sudden, and the room seemed to be getting darker. That was the last thing I
When a child is in the hospital, family does whatever it takes to stay. At Ronald McDonald House, we give them a community of support, warm meals, and a place to rest. Because when a child is in the fight of their lives, family stays. And Ronald McDonald House stays with them.
remember before waking up in a dark room, laying in a bed. I could hear the sound of music muffled behind closed doors, so I knew I was still in the frat house. It was a very dark room, however I could still make out certain furniture in the room, and a small closet door, not much else though. But even over the blaring music, I heard the sound of a plastic bag being crunched from the closet, as if somebody had stepped on it by mistake. I ran out of that room and down the stairs back to the overcrowded living room. I found my roommate and pushed him out the front door, past the group of guys still standing in a circle right next to it. During the car ride back to campus, I told my roommate I was drugged. He almost called the cops, but I said it would be foolish and pointless. My roommate then asked me an awkward question. Was I taken advantage of? I didn't feel any type of pain, and my clothes were all still on the same, so I assumed not. When I did a time check, I realized I'd only been out for maybe 10 minutes before waking up. Whatever the guy gave me must have been a dud or something, thank God. That was my college experience of attending an underground ghetto frat party, and it remains to be my scariest life experience. I had a single dorm my first semester of sophomore year. It was in the corner of the floor, kind of secluded from the rest of the dorm rooms, since it was in its own little section. You had to turn a corner to even see the door. It was nice because I'd be able to still talk with friends on my floor, invite people over to my room, and still have privacy when it was time to do homework or go to sleep. A few weeks into the semester, while studying for a bio exam, the silence was interrupted by a noise. It took me a bit to realize it was a light tapping on the door. It was so light that I almost didn't even hear it. I yelled, "Come in," but the door didn't open, so I got up to open it. Nobody was there. I walked around the corner to look down the hall. Nobody. Somebody was obviously messing with me. I went back to my bed and continued studying, this time leaving the door open. Nobody came back. The next night, a few minutes after shutting the lamp in my bedroom to go to bed, the tapping on the door returned, only this time it was much louder, more of a knocking sound. I called out, "Who is it?" and again the knocking stopped and nobody answered. I got out of my bed quickly and opened the door to see my small private corridor was void of any people. Again, I ran the 10 feet from my door to the corner to look down the main hallway of the floor. Nobody. The next morning, I asked some of the other kids in the dorm if they had been messing with me. Everyone said no. The next night, I woke up after having been asleep for 3 hours. Someone was knocking on my door again, this time louder than ever. I had trouble deciding whether to open the door or not this time. With a bout of courage, I hopped up and opened the door. Nobody was there as I was expecting, but this time I full-on sprinted down the tiny corridor isolating my room, and when I turned the corner, I saw the back of somebody disappearing behind the far corner on the opposite side of the hallway. I ran as fast as I could down the hallway, and as I turned to the next hallway where I saw the person a few seconds earlier, I saw a door at the end of the hallway shutting. It wasn't a dorm room, it was a bathroom. I felt like I was ready to confront whoever this joker was, so I pushed open the bathroom door with force. The light was off. I turned it on expecting to see somebody hiding in there, but I didn't see anyone. My first instinct was to check the 2 bathroom stalls, which were both shut. I got on my hands and knees and looked under the two stalls. Two heavy black boots could be seen from underneath one of the stall doors. I took a deep breath and pushed the stall open. I was confused. There were the boots sitting on the floor, but no person to wear them. And then I heard a creepy giggling noise. Not a feminine or childlike one. It was a kind of laughing that I could only imagine to be that of a really old crazy man. For some reason my confidence was gone and I was scared shitless. Therefore I ran back to my room and shut the door. I hopped back in my bed and started texting every friend I had. Of course everybody was asleep though. The knocking happened one more time that night. I ignored it. It went on for about 30 seconds before whoever that person was finally gave up. I spoke to everybody on my floor the next day. Nobody else heard any knocking, and everybody swore they weren't pranking me. Everybody seemed sincere. I don't know why this person chose to harass me, or who this person was. Judging by the boots and the laughing I heard, this was an older man though, and that disturbs me.
I didn't want to go back to school for another 4 years, so when I found out that it was 15 months and you become a BSN.
In 7th grade, we took an end-of-the-year field trip to an aquarium near school. It was called Ripley's Aquarium of the Smokies. We live in Gatlinburg, Tennessee, a literal mountain town, with nothing but hills and mountains as far as the eyes can see. Our science teacher, Mr. Russo, was our chaperone for the trip. He was a very lax teacher, so while other teacher chaperones were more uptight and strict with their groups, Mr. Russo was more chill about his job. That may seem like a good thing, but because of his lackadaisical approach at supervising, my friend Aiden and I were able to easily bail from the aquarium lobby, away from the rest of the groups. We quite simply didn't want to wait so long for all the groups to move. The whole aquarium was empty, except for our classes, so when Aiden and I walked through the passageways, or I guess observation areas as you would say, before everyone else, we didn't see anyone else. We got the best views at all the big fish tanks and habitats. We moved on to the next dark room, all of which were lit up with a dark blue tint from the fish tanks, by the way. This room had a lot of big tanks with tropical fish. We were making jokes about finding Nemo fish, like clownfish and the dory fish, and that's when I remember someone calling "hey" to us in a very assertive, commanding voice. It was some guy in cargo shorts and a green t-shirt. He asked us if we were with the field trip. I was about to shake my head no, but Aiden said yes. The man told us to come with him right now. We both assumed he worked for the aquarium, so we followed. He wasn't leading us back to the lobby though. He was leading us through some narrow, dark hallways. I remember passing the bathrooms and a few exit signs hanging on the ceiling before reaching an exit door. He led us outside to some back area, I guess by the woods. I finally asked if he worked there and where he was leading us. He said yes, he did work there, and that he had to drive us back around to the front of the aquarium in order to be let back in. It made just as much sense back then as it does now. But we were two nervous 7th graders who thought we were about to get in serious trouble. So when he led us to his car, we willingly got in the back seats. He told us to strap in, and he pulled out from the back parking lot and onto the street. Just as we thought he was going to make a right turn towards the front, he turned left. Right away, both Aiden and I asked him where he was going at the same time. He didn't answer that question,
but about 5 seconds later, we heard the locks to the back doors click down, and he made some kind of threat along the lines of, "If either of you try to make any moves, I'll kill you." He then proceeded to slide out what appeared to be a big knife in his glove box as some kind of threat. Aiden and I sat in silence. I'm sure he wanted to throw up just like I wanted to. We had to think of a way to escape, but we couldn't talk to each other because the man kept looking in the rearview mirror every other second. He was driving us uphill through some woodsy, isolated neighborhood until he finally pulled over onto the side of the road in what appeared to be the middle of nowhere. No houses, no through traffic. He told us to stay in the car as he got out, with his knife in his hand. I whispered to Aiden to be prepared to run as soon as I said to. The man came to my door, popped it open, and told me to step out. He told me to tell my friend that if he wants me alive, he better be in the car by the time we got back. I felt a deepening feeling in my stomach when I heard that. The man started walking me to the woods with the knife probably in his pocket, to do God knows what. I saw Aiden sliding over to my side of the car, which had an unlocked door, and when he seemed ready to run, I screamed, "Run!" Aiden was off already, running downhill. I easily dodged the man as I fled past him, following Aiden. The man tried chasing us on foot, and I'm not even kidding when I say he threw the knife at me. He missed with only maybe a few inches to spare. I heard the clanging of the knife hitting the ground ahead of me. I didn't stop to pick it up. I just kept running downhill in the direction we came. The man stopped following after throwing the knife. I think he got back in his car and fled the scene. We somehow managed to make it back to the aquarium in under an hour, and we also managed to sneak back into the group. Mr. Russo didn't even notice. Aiden and I decided to keep quiet about what just happened. What purpose would it serve getting ourselves in trouble, given that there was relatively no chance of that man getting caught? As we got older, we started to wonder more and more what the intentions of that man were. We could obviously think of a few likely ones, but either way, we kept quiet about it and don't really like to think about it. When I was in 8th grade, all of my classmates and I looked forward to our Washington, D.C. field trip. The thrill of going on any sort of trip with your friends was enough to excite us. After all preparations, we were ready for D.C. Once we arrived to our destination, my class of around 100 students were partitioned off into 3 groups, and within these groups were our 3 other hotel mates. Each group was sent off in different coach buses, and we would be taken to different attractions throughout D.C., neighboring states, monuments, parks, food stops, museums, and more. After a long weekend of visiting educational sites, our teachers decided to treat us to a colonial ghost tour one night. It was an evening walking tour through some of America's historical sites near village cemeteries and old townhomes. I don't remember exactly which city we were in, but I remember the guides telling us that many of the empty homes were preserved due to their historical significance. I've always been scared of most things related to ghosts and such, but I was positive that nothing would happen in our ghost tour. We split off into smaller groups of around 10 members each, and were instructed to carry around a camera if we wished. The guide kept telling us not to expect much from the tour, that there would most likely be nothing supernatural during the course of the evening. As we wandered from colonial home to cemetery plot to colonial home, I just took interest in the histories that the guides would share of each home. They would indulge us in the stories of each homeowner, while my friends would snap away at photos, hoping to find a shiny orb. One of my friends, Jessica, that I was sharing a room with during that trip, was not one of the kids that were constantly taking pictures. She would take a photograph every once in a while, but spent most of the time listening. My group reached a small 2-story home in the middle of the street. The house had an ominous blue hue to the windows, but the house was vacant. I remember being very curious about this home. The tour guide began to tell us a little bit about the house. She had mentioned that the home had originally belonged to a man and his beautiful wife. He adored his wife, and the couple was thrilled to receive news that they would be expecting a child. Unfortunately, the wife had died after giving birth to a baby girl. The man was absolutely devastated and grew to resent his homely daughter. During her childhood, he kept her in the house as much as he could, He reminded her about how homely she looked and could not find her a suitor. Feeling that she had no other purpose, he had his daughter learn how to sew and weave upstairs, using her only good attribute, her hands. After hearing this story, I remember the sorrow that I felt for this girl. She and her father must have lived unhappily in that house until their deaths. My friend Jessica took a photograph of the house, and we both moved on to the next house. I kept walking until Jessica stopped and became silent, looking down in her digital camera screen. I walked over and scanned the photograph. I saw a gleam coming from the edge of the second floor window on the right. I had her zoom on the scene. After zooming in, you could clearly see 3 figures staring out from the window. On the way right was the translucent outline of a woman. A taller man was standing behind her to the side. Even more curiously, there was a third figure. It appeared to be a woman, but she was harder to make out. The body was there for sure, but her skin was not as clear. Jessica and I freaked out. The first woman and man made sense to me. That would explain the man and his daughter. But who was this third dark woman off the side? I raised my hand and had to ask the guide, was there ever another person that lived with this family at the house we just looked at? The guide looked surprised at my question and answered, yeah, during the time of their residence, they had a black female servant living with them. Senior year of high school. My forensics teacher, Mr. Stevenson, somehow convinced the school to let him take us on a field trip to some abandoned building in the woods that was the site of a major crime scene. I think he might have finessed it a bit and made the school think we'd just be studying the perimeter and outside of the building, but we did much more than that. Mainly, it used to be a drug den. When we got there, I realized how frighteningly tall the building actually was, and its location was just surreal, surrounded by forest in every direction, and the only road that leads up to it is a road you would never think to drive down just because of the grass growing in the street. Since our current topic at the time of our class was dealing with drugs, Mr. Stevenson led us into the abandoned building. He gave a tour of the place as if he'd been there many times before, and he seemed to know quite a bit of history about the building. For example, that the actual original purpose of the building was unknown. Apparently, construction on the higher levels wasn't even finished before the building was abandoned. Its location and size made it ideal for drug deals and other illegal activity to take place, which surprised all of us since there we were, inside of this apparent former drug den for a school field trip. Mr. Stevenson was so laxed about this trip that he didn't even notice when a couple students wandered off to explore on their own. Or maybe he just didn't care. Given that a few other students did it, me and my friend Gianna, or G, decided to go off on our own too. And yes, I'm a guy. I just so happened to have a really close friend that was a girl back in high school. There had to be at least 8 floors in this building, but we saw from the outside the top few floors looked unfinished. I basically forced G to come all the way upstairs with me to the top few floors. Worst came to worst, we wouldn't be able to find the group again, and we just returned to the bus right outside. We climbed the stairs, one flight after another. It was weird. As we reached the middle floors, the amount of debris and graffiti lessened a bit, but then as we got to the higher floors, there was even more graffiti and litter than the lower floors. Then things got sketchy. It seemed we were on the second highest floor, and everything on this floor was still just wood foundation. A lot of it seemed to be rotting, and there were a lot of holes up there. We would have gone up to the last floor, but the stairs had been completely stripped and broken. Basically, there were no stairs to the last floor. There had to be a way up there, though. So we watched our step for weak wood as we navigated the floor. Then, Gianna grabbed my shoulder and stopped me. She pointed up at a hole in the ceiling and said she saw something. Then there was a ticking noise, like the kind of ticking noise a person makes when they're calling their cat or something. Followed by that, someone's arm came into view from the hole above us. Just their arm, though. And judging by the position of the arm, whoever's arm it was must have been laying down flat on the floor beside the hole. They had a long black sleeve on, so the only skin that was visible was their hand. G was scared. I laughed a little at first, but I'm not going to say it wasn't slightly unnerving. Gianna started telling me let's go back down. I started calling up to the person, how do we get up there? They didn't answer. Instead, they just kept making the ticking noise and waving us up. That's when things started getting really creepy, and I agreed with G that we should go back down. Right after I said this, the person pulled their arm out from the hole, and we heard the sound of a shoe quickly scrape the wood foundation above us as the person was clearly getting up. We couldn't see though. I nudged Gianna to move. I was creeped out and just wanted to get back down. As we were about to leave the main open layout room and back into the stairway corridor, there was a crash far behind us. We turned and saw a man on the complete opposite side of the room, facing the wall. It seemed he just jumped through one of the holes. He then quickly turned his head to look at us, without moving his body. There was something about his face and clothing. He didn't look like the typical urban exploration type. He looked dangerous and unstable. G and I ran for it now, down one flight of stairs at a time. 3 flights down, I looked up the long corridor above us and saw the man at top looking down at me. I yelled go to Gianna. We kept going down. Like 5 flights later, I looked up again, and there was the man again, looking down at me. This time he seemed much closer, and I just realized he'd been chasing us. We got to the bottom, and I looked up one more time, and I didn't see him this time. We heard the voice of Mr. Stevenson nearby, and I kind of started to laugh about what just happened. Not exactly because I found it funny, but because I was just happy that we made it back safely. G was not laughing though. She was genuinely disturbed. We found Mr. Stevenson, who asked where we were, and we told the truth about what just happened. He was pretty mad at us, but given what we just told him, he also advised we should leave the building. The other kids who wandered off had returned, and when we got to the bus, Mr. Stevenson did a head count like 3 times. Overall, the trip wasn't a failure for the rest. The other kids did learn things about the building and drugs, but for my friend Gianna and I, really, it was the most horrific thing we ever went through.
Nationwide is so much more than a great insurance company. They're one of America's largest financial services companies. Like how
I was a new student to Southern Lehigh High School in Pennsylvania. Going into my junior year of high school, not knowing anyone was really rough. Everyone obviously had their friend group sorted out by then. The worst part was lunchtime, though. My school wouldn't let juniors leave for lunch, only seniors, so I had to eat in the cafeteria. I was dreading it because I knew I'd have no one to sit with, and I didn't want to force myself into a random table. When lunchtime finally came, however, I walked into the cafeteria with my tray of food looking for a place to sit. Every single table was taken. I didn't even have the option of sitting alone. But there was one table in the corner of the cafeteria with only 2 kids sitting at it. That was the least intimidating spot to sit, so I walked over and asked if I could sit there. They both looked at each other, and one of them said, "Yeah." I noticed upon sitting down that the two were identical twins. They looked like they were partially of Hispanic heritage, but they didn't have accents. They honestly seemed alright. They introduced themselves as Antonio and Bruno, and they had a conversation with me. They invited me to hang out with them after school, and honestly, I figured, why not? I had to start off somewhere as far as making friends. I got their numbers, and after school, I went home to drop off all my stuff. Shortly after, I got a text from Bruno, telling me he and his brother were planning on hanging out. He told me to meet them around 9 that night at the nearby cemetery that was like a 10-minute walk from my house. He said there was a cool hangout spot near there. Plus, the first day of school was on a Friday, so we had off the next day. I had nothing to do, so I said, yeah, I'm down. When the time came, Bruno texted me one more time asking if I was still coming. I said, yeah, I'm gonna leave in a few, and confirmed we were meeting on the road by the cemetery. He said, yeah. So I began my walk in the dark to the cemetery. The longer I walked, the more I thought about my whole move and being the new kid in high school, and thinking about the fact that I was literally walking to a cemetery at night to hang out with two kids I just met. But anyway, I got to the little road next to the cemetery and asked Bruno where they were. He started typing right away, and he said they were in the woods hanging by a small lake that they wanted to show me. Then he promptly sent his location. So I made my way into the woods, pushing branches out of my way, using my tiny phone flashlight as my only light. I started calling for Bruno and Antonio as I felt like I was close enough, according to the location he sent me at least. Suddenly I heard footsteps, so I stopped. Definitely footsteps approaching me, but they were very low and slow. They called out that they better not be trying to scare me. When they weren't answering me though, I decided this was stupid. I turned and started walking back towards the road. But those footsteps I mentioned earlier, they turned from quiet and slow to fast, and before I could even react, someone had their nails digging into my neck, effectively choking me. I heard a familiar voice screaming, "Grab him, grab him." I managed to break free from this sort of chokehold and sprinted towards the road. I know they followed me until the tree line by the road. I was faster than them, and I could run for miles. And that's what I did. I ran straight home and told my parents. They considered calling the cops, but I thought it would be better to get pictures of the nail marks on my neck and report it to the school the next day. That's what we did, and with the help of the text that I got from Bruno, I was able to get the two students expelled. My parents made me block both their numbers. I didn't exactly argue with that though. My parents wanted me to confirm that these kids didn't know where we lived, and I told them simply, not as far as I know. So anyway, one night about a week later, I woke up to my room feeling really cold. I heard the sound of wind blowing into my room, and I looked at the window to see it was slid completely open. I wondered if my mom came in to open it, but that would make absolutely no sense. It was like 50 degrees out that night. I walked over to it and looked down below. A few feet below my bedroom window, there's a part of the exterior of my house that comes outward, creating a sort of ledge underneath my window that my father always told me to jump onto in case of a fire. I shut my window and walked over to my parents' bedroom. I gently knocked and opened the door, and my mom groggily asked what. I had to ask her if she opened my window. She sat up saying, "No, why?" I told her in a louder, more concerned voice now that my window was opened all the way by somebody. She started shaking my dad to wake him up and go check my room with me. But when he woke up, he told me to grow up and go back to sleep. I left my parents' door open as I walked back down the hall to my room. Then, I picked up on something that I'm surprised I picked up on. My door. It seemed to be half shut now, as opposed to completely open when I left. I pushed the door open just a little bit so I could get a look through the crack and see if, someone was behind the door. Even though I had the thought of the possibility, I never could have actually expected to see it. There was someone hiding behind my door. I screamed for my dad like a little girl. I screamed so loud I'm sure it could be heard 3 doors down. Then my door suddenly slammed shut, just as my dad came rushing out of his room over to me. I screamed there's people in my room, so he barged into the room and turned the light on. At that moment, we saw the leg of a person jumping out my window. My dad ran to the window, then downstairs and out the front door to attempt to chase them down, but he came back a few minutes later out of breath, saying he didn't see anyone. Full of energy and fear, I swore it had to be those twins that I got expelled. My dad called the police, and I had to talk to them when they arrived, explaining the whole story back to the incident in the woods. My father backed up my story, but without proof of who entered, they said there wasn't anything they could do. They merely ordered us to lock the doors and consider installing cameras outside. As positive I am that it was either one of or both of those twins in my room, after getting through a solid couple months of sleeping in fear, nothing to this nature ever happened again. Looking back now, I don't know why I was so willing to meet these kids in the woods at night. I should have realized in the cafeteria that day that they looked like trouble, and I should have stayed away. Freshman year of high school, 2007. Gym class last period. We had a substitute gym teacher on one of the stormiest days of the year. He was an older man, not a senior citizen, but gray, maybe 55 to 60. He took attendance, and when he passed me, he did a double take at me, which I found a bit uncomfortable. Not to float my own boat, but I always understood I looked older and really good for a freshman in high school. The sub told us to get into our volleyball teams, and he disappeared into the hall by the locker rooms for a while. 40 minutes went by and the period was over. It was time for us to get changed and go home. I got into the locker room, but for some reason, my locker wasn't opening. I tried my usual combination over and over and over. It wouldn't click open though. I had to go to the sub and let him know to ask for my combination again. I figured maybe the combo just slipped from my mind for some reason. The sub told me to give him a few minutes and he'd get the list of locker combos. I waited outside the office, and out he finally came with a book in his hands, open to a specific page. He walked into the girls' locker room with me, which I didn't expect him to do. The locker room was basically empty now, with one girl finishing up changing. He walked over to my locker and tried the combination written down on the paper. It didn't work no matter how many times he tried it. Each time he tried it and failed, he would look at me and laugh. I would force myself to laugh along to be polite, but it started getting weird. He put his hand on my shoulder as he said, "We'll figure this out." He tried the combination again, with his hand still on my shoulder. When it didn't work again, I felt his hand slowly started inching down from my shoulder to my lower back. I pushed myself away and grabbed my bag, saying, "It's okay, I'm late for my bus." He tried a combo in the locker one more time, and it opened. He smiled and walked away. I waited till I heard the locker room door shut. Then I proceeded to getting changed quickly, when suddenly the room went dark. I finished pulling out my pants and shut my locker in the dark. I threw on my backpack and started walking to the back exit of the locker room, which led outside. I feared that the sub would be waiting right by the door for me. I got predatory vibes from him. When I got to the end of that specific aisle of lockers I was in the intersection of 2 rows. I'd have to turn down left to get to the exit door, but still. Naturally, I had to look right to make sure that it was clear. There was a little light seeping in from one single rectangular window that sat under the ceiling. It was enough. Enough for me to see him peeking at me from around the wall of lockers. So that's when I ran for the exit door. He came over behind me saying, wait, it's not what it looks like." I ran outside into the rain off the campus of the high school and walked the rest of the way home, giving me time to reflect on what happened. By the time I got home, soaking wet, it came to me that he most likely changed my locker combination somehow as a way of getting alone with me in the locker room. As for what he could have possibly been planning to do when he cut the lights, I never wanted to imagine. Honestly, I was too emotionally scared and quite frankly embarrassed to tell anyone about it, not even my parents or friends. It was something I just kept to myself all these years, because truthfully, I just don't feel comfortable telling people. When I was in high school, I was in the band. At my school, band was basically an easy A. It was either that, orchestra, or chorus, so I went with band. Anyhow, our band teacher, Mr. Nicholson, had the grading system set up so that as long as you attended class and went to your weekly lessons, you got an A. Sadly, towards the end of one quarter, I was missing 2 lessons. Because of that, my grade was a B. I went to him after class to ask if I could make up the lessons, and even though he seemed reluctant, he said he would let me come in during a lunch period and practice in one of the downstairs storage rooms to get credit for a lesson. I was more than happy with that, because realistically, I would probably just play games on my phone anyway instead of actually practicing. I arrived to the music room during my lunch period the next day, so I took my saxophone and headed down the stairs outside the music room towards the basement area for the music department. It was always kind of creepy down there because absolutely no one besides the music teachers would go down there usually, and the lights were kind of shitty. I'd only been down there a couple times before that day. But anyway, I walked down the hallway, and on either side were a bunch of doors that led into small, maybe 7 by 7 feet rooms. All of these rooms were used for storing things like chairs, music stands, spare instruments, Christmas decorations, and whatever. I stepped into one of the rooms and shut the door. I set up my music on one of the stands in the room just in case Mr. Nicholson were to come down to check on me. But really, I didn't plan on actually playing. I started playing games on my phone and then flick. Darkness. Like, as dark as it could get. Minus my phone screen. I looked over to the light switch to the room just instinctively, flicked it up and down a few times, but that did nothing. I stumbled as I got up from the seat to open the door, to more darkness. I held my phone out in front of me to light up this little hallway, even if it was just barely. I think I had like an iPhone 3 or something, and those old ones didn't have flashlights. But anyway, that little light from my phone was enough to see one of the doors open near the end of the hall, and I heard something being dragged in that room, like one of the big plastic containers. There was also manic breathing, followed by animal-like grunting. Then I saw a big plastic container being pushed out of that room into the hallway. As I saw this, I turned off my phone screen and went back into the room I was just in. I shut the door so quietly. I don't know what exactly I was thinking in that moment that I decided to hide, but I think the strange sounds I was hearing from this person, mixed with the random blackout, made me wary of staying in that hallway. Whoever that was blocking the stairs though. Of course, I got no reception down in that little basement area. All I felt comfortable doing was sitting in that room and waiting for the lights to hopefully turn back on. But the lights seemed like they were never going to turn back on. So I decided I would try and get back upstairs again. I quietly opened the door with my phone in front of me for light. Then I stepped into the hall. I inched up a little closer to the stairs, then I heard something again. I quickly crept into the next closest room with the door open and shut it. I still didn't know what I was hiding from. Could it have been a staff member or janitor? At that point, the only reason I had of thinking it wasn't was because they only appeared down there after the lights turned off. I stood in that room in complete darkness, only listening and waiting for another sound from outside. But you know how when you're in a room with someone, even if you don't necessarily hear them, you can kind of just sense their presence? That's suddenly the feeling I got standing in that pitch black room. I lifted my shaking hand up and pressed the home button on my phone to turn on the screen, just for half a second. That was enough to see someone standing in the corner of this little storage room, 3 feet away from me. I pretended I didn't see anything, but it was too late. Shh, is what I heard.
breaking the silence. Then, a hand patted my shoulder twice and started squeezing it. I basically dove for the doorknob, struggling to find it at first, but pulling the door open when I did. The man in the room with me tried pushing the door shut after I opened it, but I was already out. I ran up the stairs and out the door to the main level of the music hall, where the lights were still on. I ran to Mr. Nicholson to tell him, out of breath. He called security to check the basement section of the music hall, but security came back upstairs and said besides a bunch of music equipment moved around, there wasn't anyone down there. The rest of the period, Mr. Nicholson canceled his flute lesson, and I sat there in the room with him and 5 flute players, explaining the whole story in detail. Without cameras in the music hall, there was no way of catching whoever went down there and killed the power for the basement. It seemed that he was trying to steal expensive music equipment. That, or God knows what else. The next day, I was called into the dean's office to give my story of what happened, and the rest is history. One night, my friends and I hatched a genius plan. We'd sneak into the high school basement through one of the windows that was broken and never fixed. The thing about this window, you'd have to hop a short metal gate surrounding an outside staircase leading to the basement. Not that it would effectively stop anyone, but it added that extra barrier that makes you feel like you're really doing something devious when you crossed over it. We made sure there weren't any security cars anywhere nearby and hopped the gate. Crawling in through the window proved difficult, considering we had to boost ourselves up, then crawl through an insanely skinny opening. But once we were in, we were in. We kind of dispersed from each other to explore different areas. One thing was for sure, the basement of the school was a mess, and anything but interesting. There was little light. One small white light was on in a far corner, and the exit sign light actually produced more light than you'd think. I was looking around when I saw one of my friends in front of me. He whispered, "Let's go upstairs." So I followed him upstairs, and he opened the door up to the main hallway of the school. Everything was dark. I always thought there were at least some lights left on in the school at night. But no, not a single light was on. And all that really stood out as far as the eye could see were the various exit signs glowing red. I followed my friend down the hall and remembered saying, "Dude, this is really creepy." And he replied back, "Shh." But I realized he was right. Who knew if somebody else could be in the building besides my friends and I? Little did I know just yet. I followed my friend to the bathroom, and he went into one of the stalls. I whispered, "Hurry up." I waited for a while. Then my phone started to ring. I picked up, and it was one of my friends, Chris. He asked, "Where the hell did you go?" I said I'm upstairs with either Roland or Brandon. He said, "What do you mean? They're with me." And right after, both Brendan and Roland said hi, apparently on speakerphone. I stuttered the word "I" and stopped, trying to think straight. Then, there was a laughing coming from in the stall. Not the laugh of any of my friends. I looked up at the stall. There was someone looking over it at me, probably standing on the toilet. I screamed "holy shit" over and over into the phone as I left the bathroom. Shortly after I was out, I heard the stall door slam shut. I tried to run back to the basement in the dark, but it wasn't too easy to find in the dark. Luckily, I managed to find it, so I started to scream their names as I ran down the stairs. I screamed "go, go" when they answered, and we one by one jumped off some kind of bucket onto the window ledge and crawled back outside. I was the first one out though, afraid that person from the bathroom was following. When we were all outside, I explained to them, out of breath, while also laughing now that I felt safe with all of them next to me. I guess we were loud or something though, because as we all just started looking around at the whole school building and all the classroom windows, in one of the downstairs windows was someone with their hands pressed up on the glass. We could only see maybe half their face. I said that's gotta be him, as Roland ushered us to get the hell out of there. We ran until we were off the premises of the school, and that was that. We came up with a lot of possible explanations, but none of them really made sense. Obviously, we never did anything like that again, though.
all-new, all-electric Subaru Solterra flips convention on its head.